The first few words of 1 Corinthians 6, verse 11, read this way: "And such were some of you." I believe if you will dedicate your life to looking at the Scriptures, you will recognize that there are things in this life that are good for us to do, such as we're doing right now. It is good to worship. You'll recognize that it is good for us to do such as we did an hour ago or in the previous hour, to study God's Word together. You'll also notice as you look at the Scriptures, there are things in this life that we should refrain from or abstain from. And thus in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 11, the writer says, "And such were some of you." The people we're reading about here in verse 11 used to be the things as mentioned in the previous verses, but they changed based upon the fact that they are now inside of Christ. And thus you read these words, "But ye are washed, but ye are sanctified, but ye are justified in the name of the Lord Jesus." I think we can all say as Christians that there are things that we used to do that we no longer do. I think we can all say as Christians that since we have entered into that relationship with the Lord, that we have continued to change things in our lives for the better. And thus there are things that maybe we did just some short time ago that we now no longer do based upon the knowledge that we find inside of the Scriptures. You and I need the Scriptures. We need them to know about God, but we need them to know about ourselves and how we should live and what we should be doing in this life. For just a few moments of our time, I want us to look at a lesson entitled, "Four Forgotten Sins." I was reviewing my sermon schedule over the last 2 or 3 years and recognized that there were a few things that we've just not given the time that we really needed. Some of the things we really need, others we need just a little bit, but they are things that we seem to forget. We don't give them the emphasis that they might need. I don't think we think about them very often because the 4 things that we're going to discuss today are really ways that the world lives in every day. We're surrounded by them on a daily basis. We see them in television shows. We see them in the way our world works. And sometimes that makes us a little accustomed to these things. It makes it easy for us to look at them and just say, "I've seen that before." Before we get to the 4 things we're going to look at, I want us to recognize what sin is, because we need to be reminded of the definition of sin. And as you look inside of Scripture, you'll find passages like 1 John 3:4. "Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law." Now listen to the last part of the verse. "For sin is the transgression of the law." You and I need to be reminded from time to time what sin is. And I believe 1 John 3:4 is the greatest definition. Sin is a transgression, a going against, a ignoring of God's Word. But maybe that's not the only thing that we need to be reminded of, because we need to be reminded of our part with sin. Many times we live our lives and we say these words, "It wasn't my fault." Have you ever said this in your life? Maybe you said it much more when you were younger, or maybe you say it much more now. You'll have to determine, but "He made me do it." Maybe you hear your children say that. Or maybe you've said these words, or maybe you've used these words before, "I didn't do that." You see, many times we like to ignore the middle letter of the word sin. We like to ignore the I. "I didn't do that. Someone else made me do that. I'll never." And sometimes that's how we live. We need to recognize that the book of James, as you roll into James chapter 1 and start in verse 13 and go through a few passages, that you will recognize some principles when it comes to sin. Number 1, inside of verse 13, you and I learn that it is not God that tempts man. He does not tempt with evil, neither is he tempted with evil. But you roll down into verses 14 and 15, and we'll see verse 16 in just a minute, and it reads this way: But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, it bringeth forth death. There are things that affect you that don't bother me. And there are things that bother me that do not bother you. You and I need to understand that we are drawn away due to our own desires in this life, and in those desires, we violate, we trespass God's law. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not God's fault. If it were God's fault, then God would have had to died for God. But you read in passages like John 3:16, and of course verse 17, that Jesus did not die for himself. He died for us, didn't he? And therefore we learn not only inside of the book of James, but also in the life of Jesus about this sin that's discussed. But I want you to see verse 16, because I believe it has a great implication on our lives. Do not err, my beloved brethren. I want you to look at the word err for just a minute. It's not a word that we use very often. It's not a word that we use in our daily lives, but it means do not roam or go astray, my beloved brethren, he writes. It means do not be deceived or be seduced, my dear brethren. It means do not be out of the way, my beloved brethren. The way is given to us inside of his word, and we can know the way. Did Jesus not say, I am the way, the truth, and the life? Followed up with, and no man cometh to the Father but by me. In other words, the writer of James in James 1 verse 16 is telling us not to be out of the way of Jesus. The four things I want us to look at today that keep us out of the way of Christ are very simple. I want to look at the sin of lying, the sin of gossip, the sin of swearing, which would be twofold, and then the sin of criticism that exists in this life. Let's begin by looking at the first, the sin of lying. Two things we're going to notice in the sin of lying. Let's define, number one, the father of lying. Who is the one who influences us to do this? And then number two, let's notice that lying is against the nature of God. You go over to the book of John, in John chapter 8, verse 44, and you read these words, ye are of the father, the devil. The lust of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh out of his own, for he is a liar. And listen to the last part of verse 44. And the father of it. You and I need to recognize in principle number one, when talking about lying, in other words, not telling the truth. Isn't lying very simple? I believe it is, isn't it? It's either we are telling the truth or we are not, isn't it? You know, a half-truth is not the truth. We oftentimes will define lying out this way. It was a little, what do we say? A little white lie. We try to tell ourselves, oh, it wasn't that bad. Why do we do that? Well, I believe we do that, number one, because the father of lying is the devil himself. And I believe we tell ourselves that it was just a little thing. It wasn't that big of a deal. No one's going to know because of what happens in John 8, verse 44. Not only are we after him as the father of lying, but we read about him in John 8:44 as being an individual of whom no truth is in him. Go back to the very beginning and see the one that's called the devil. What did he tell both Adam and Eve? Thou shalt not surely die. Was that a truth or was that a lie? You see, the father of lies began with the first two individuals by introducing them to the half-truth. Which brings us to the very second point of our idea of lying. Lying is against God. Now, you and I can go to the book of Proverbs, and we can recognize in the book of Proverbs that lying is not the only thing that God does hate. The beginning of Proverbs 6, verse 16 says this, these 6 things the Lord hates, yea, 7 are an abomination unto him. You and I need to recognize that there are things that God hates. That's a very strong word, isn't it? We've heard a lot of that word in our world recently. We've heard of hate speech. We've heard of hate groups. We've heard of the hate mentality. But here's something we need to recognize. There are things in this life that you and I should hate, that we should oppose, that we should stand against, that we should never allow into our lives. That's the definition of how God hates. Read with me as we begin in verse 17. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. Now pause with me for just a moment. How impressive is the phrase, hands that shed innocent blood? It's a twofold phrase. Number one, an adult who sheds the innocent blood of another adult. And number two, think about the children in this country and in this world whose blood was shed. And if there's anyone who is innocent, ladies and gentlemen, it's a child. I want you to begin with the magnitude of Proverbs 6, 16 and 17. It begins with hands that shed innocent blood, a heart rolling into it, a heart that devises wicked imagination, feet that are swift to running into mischief, a false witness that speaks lies, and he that soweth discord among the brethren. Is it really a little white lie? I know that you may be sitting there thinking, well, that's just too simple, Jonathan. Well, is it? We live in a complicated world. Sometimes do we make religion too complicated? Is it a little white lie? Well, I'll tell you this, it's connected to a big red-stained passage in the book of Proverbs. Of course, the concept of lying is not only talked about in the Old Testament, but as we looked at just a moment ago in John 8:44, it's talked about in the New Testament. It's also talked about in the book of James and even in the book of Revelation as those who will be in the place that's called hell, who are those that are liars. We need to think about our words and recognize that the sin of lying, it comes from the father of lies, but it also is against God. Number one, the sin of lying. Number two, I want you to look with me at the sin of gossip. Now, this is not one that gets talked about very often, is it? Matter of fact, I would suggest to you that lying may be talked about more than gossiping because we don't want to hear about gossiping, do we? Because we don't want to be, if you'll allow me to say it this way, we don't want to be guilty, do we? It is really easy to pick up the phone and hear these phrases. Did you hear what so-and-so did? Have you heard what's going on? Now, you and I know that happens in our world. Oh, we see it on television. We see it in the work relationships that exist. We see it all over our world. But let me ask this question. Does it exist in the church? I'm going to suggest to you that as long as people are in the church, sin will unfortunately permeate the whole. Sometimes they're big things like we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 where an individual needed to be withdrawn from. But folks, sin is sin. And gossip is unfortunately one of those things that does affect us because we do see it so prevalently in our society. Two things I want you to notice. I want you to see a phrase that's inside of the New Testament. I want you to see this phrase, things which they ought not. And then number two, I want you to see something that will help us calm the contentions that come about when gossiping or secret telling or not your secret telling takes place. Let's begin by looking in the New Testament by going to 1 Timothy chapter 5. And I want you to notice with me verse 13 when it comes to gossiping. These are the things which they ought not. It reads this way, and withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. Did you know that there are things that we should never repeat? I think we understand that there are words that we should never repeat. There is foul language that should never be repeated by the Christian. But there are other things that the Christian should never repeat, aren't there? I think there are. Matter of fact, I think 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 13 proves that to me. There were individuals here, and it seems that they had idle hands. They had plenty of time to burn, and boy, they did it well. But I want you to see something for just a moment. You don't just have to have idle hands to be someone who tells the secrets of others. In this particular occasion here in 1 Timothy 5, there was a group of people who, well, they were idle. And they went, I love this illustration, from house to house. You see this phrase in the New Testament often, from house to house. And often you see that phrase in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts, talking about how Christians went from house to house, not only with one another, but to spread the gospel from house to house. That's not this here in 1 Timothy 5. They went from house to house, and the first phrase went like this: "Did you hear?" And it was not their information to tell. I know for a fact that this has happened in our world, sometimes even among members of the church. The word busybody, interestingly enough, is a word that means, now listen to this, this is ironic to me according to Strong's, curious arts. Isn't that interesting to you? When you're so curious in everybody else's business that you're willing to paint a picture that's not yours. Boy, that's interesting to me, isn't it? I don't think we have to today spend time describing what it means to gossip. I don't think I have to give you examples, because you and I know that when we tell things that are not ours to tell, to others that it's not theirs to hear, from stories that are not ours to live, that we have involved ourselves in something that is sinful. When we're involved in curious arts, when we're idle, and when we're, look in verse 13 here, when we are tattlers, telling of stories that do not belong to us, we need to be reminded these are things which they ought not. Thus the writer tells these individuals, it happens to be the ladies of specific that he's writing to here in 1 Timothy 5, but it does not have to be just ladies, does it? Is it just ladies who gossip? It's not, is it? You and I understand that this world is just as equal, and both men and women can follow after the same pitfalls in this life, and there are things which we ought not. But there is one way to calm the contentions that exist in this world due to the gossiping or the tattling or the curious arts of which exist. And it comes from a principle from Proverbs 26, verse 20. It reads this way: "Where there is no wood, the fire goeth out. So where there is no talebearer, the strife ceases." This word talebearer here is akin to the word in the New Testament busybody. It's also akin to the word in the New Testament that we found a moment ago, a tattler, of whom tells stories that do not belong. Look at the illustration here. Where there is no wood. What do you need to have a fire? Well, you need something to burn, don't you? Here the illustration is given to us. Where there is no wood, listen to this, the fire goes out. I want you to illustrate into your minds and into mine that this concept of gossiping or curious arts or tale-bearing is connected to fire. Do you see that here in Proverbs 26? It's connected to fire, but it's not just connected to you. It's connected to all of those that are consumed about with the wood, the gossip of which you are spreading. Do you know the easiest principle to remember when it comes to lying and gossip and swearing and undue criticism? I'll give it to you before we end. Do you know what the best principle about it is? Matter of fact, I'll illustrate it to you. You ready? Get it? Where there's no wood, the fire goes out. Now, the American Standard Version says, where there is no whisperer, that the contentions will cease. These are not things that you may say aloud in front of great groups of public, but it may be something that you whisper in the background for others to hear. Where there is no wood, there is no fire. So you and I need to understand that there are things which we ought not do. 1 Timothy 5, verse 13 tells us that. And we need to recognize that there's a way to calm contentions. And sometimes it's just shutting the old mouth, getting rid of the wood from the fire, and leaving it alone. Number 3 in our list of the 4 forgotten sins, let's recognize the sin of swearing. Now, to do this, I want us to look at multiple principles. Number 1, I want us to recognize the 2 ideas that are involved, because there are 2 different ways to look at the word swearing, and we need to see that as we are here this morning. And then number 2, I want us to look at the principle of the lips. And I believe the principle of the lips will absolutely astound all of us, because we need to recognize as God's people, listen to the way I'm saying this, as God's people, I'm not talking about the world right now, I'm talking about us, that there is a principle that involves the lips. And if you haven't realized it yet, these 4 things that we're looking at, what do they all involve? The lips, the mouth, the tongue. Matter of fact, the book of James says the tongue is the unruly member and the hardest to control. But isn't it interesting that God gave us 1 mouth and 2 ears? That's interesting, isn't it? I believe it's a point in the design of God to help us understand that the mouth must be used appropriately. Let's begin by looking at the sin of swearing and looking at the 2 ideas involved. Now, to do this, go with me to Matthew 5. Matthew chapter 5. And let's illustrate the first idea. And it begins with us in Matthew 5 and looking at verse 33. Matthew 5 and looking at verse 33. Read with me 33 through 37 together. It reads, of the words of Jesus, again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but perform or shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou cannot make one hair white or black. But let your communication be yea for yea, and nay for nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. The idea of swearing. I swear to you by. I love the principle here about why we should not do this. Number 1, we should not do this by God's name because it's not ours. Number 2, I should not do it by heaven because it is not ours, it's God's. Number 2, I can't do it by the earth because it is his footstool. Think about where you fit in the design of things. The footstool of God. Now, that's not a derogatory notion to man, but it does recognize our lowly position based upon where God is and where he always will be. But it's these things that take place later. Really, I guess it's verse 36 that just gets my attention. Neither will you swear by your head. Why? Because you can't make your hair white or black. Now, how many of you, through means, and you don't have to raise your hand on this, but just think about it. It'll be humorous to me at least. How many of you, by a modern bottle, have changed your color? Maybe by choice, maybe because some is gray. Now think about this. How many of you, by decision, told your hair to go white or black? I have found, and you may find this as well, that your hair becomes rather humorous as you get older. It will either be with you or it will leave you. It will either stand up or it will sit down. It'll either turn white or it'll stay black. Kelly walked up to me as I was standing in our bathroom the other day, and she said, "You've got a lot of white hair in your beard." I said, "Thanks." You know what's not happened since that day? That was just a few days ago. I've not turned one of them black. Matter of fact, I don't know if you can see it, but right here's nice little streaks. They're getting rather white thick. I have not turned them black yet. Therefore, what good does it do me to swear that I'll do something based upon my head? Why? Because I don't have the power to do that. I don't have the ability to promise that, but I can say, verse 37, I can say yes for yes, and I can say no for no. And the last part of this is where we get in trouble. Anything more than that becomes evil. Therefore, we've got to think about our tongue and the way we swear to do things. Next, I want you to move to the book of Colossians. I want you to go to Colossians chapter 4. I want you to see something about our words that have to do with swearing. Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that ye may know how ye ought to answer every man. Now, I know, folks, that this passage is talking about how we respond with biblical responses. But I believe there's a dual nature purpose here in Colossians 4:6 about the words that we speak. There are words that are foul. We used to call them swear words. Now we've called them foul words. I don't know if we're trying to make them better or we're trying to make them worse, trying to make them easier, trying to make them harder to say. But there are things that Christians should never say. And by the way, it's not just swear words or foul words of which should not be said. Our words should always be seasoned with salt, provided with grace. Why? Why should they be that way? Well, you hold that question with me, and I want you to go with me to James chapter 3. And I want you to see the principle of the lips. James chapter 3, specifically verse 11. It's a very important verse talking about our words, our responses to the world, how we view God, how we view the world, how we live, how we speak. It talks about a fountain. Does a fountain send forth at the same place sweet and bitter? Which one? Does a fountain of water? You go to the water fountain that's in the back of this building, really, I guess it would be the front of this building. Or you go to the water fountain that's in the educational wing, or the two that are in the first floor of the new building, or the two that are in the bottom floor of the new building. Isn't it interesting also how we call buildings? It's getting close to 10 to 13 years old and it's still new. You go to any of those fountains and do you expect good water or bad water? And can it bring both at the same time? The answer is no. Verse 11 here is one of those principles, one of those passages that makes us go, huh. Now make the application to your lips. Will you bring forth good, or will you bring forth evil? Here's the true principle of the lips. The choice is up to us. And that moves us to our final point, the sin of undue criticism. It has to do with the words that we use and the way that we follow after people, because there's two principles I want you to see. There is the fact that our eyes deceive us, and we need to recognize that. Then there's something I want you to see, and it's where I want us to end together. It's the brethren concept. Let's begin by looking at the fact that our eyes deceive us, and this comes from James chapter 4. It reads this way when you pick up in verse 11, "Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judgeth his brother speaketh evil of the law and judgeth the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that thou judgest another?" Actually, I skipped to the brethren concept. I'm sorry. We'll go ahead and talk about that now. I've already done it. Let's move our PowerPoint forward. The brethren concept. Maybe that's better to look at anyways. Here's the concept here. You ready for it? Look at the second word of James 4:11. I'm not sure if I'm the first one to ever tell you this. I have a feeling I'm not. But no means no. And let me say it how it is in James 4:11. Not means not. Listen to it again. Speak not evil. Well, of who? One of another. How many times are we good at doing that? Many times it's because of what happens in John chapter 7, verse 24. Our eyes deceive us. Have you ever thought about your eyes for just a moment before we read the passage? What can your eyes see? Well, our eyes can see a lot of things, can't they? Our eyes can see colors. Our eyes can see people. They can see buildings. They can see nature. But that's not the way we're asking the question. What can your eyes see? Think about it. What can your eyes see? Only what's right in front of them. You and I are not privy to all the information of this world. We're not privy to the information of which led the elders to their decisions, or the information that led someone else to make their personal decisions. We're not privy to that. Why? Because our eyes only see what? What's right in front of us. And our eyes deceive us. John 7:24, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. How many times do we want to judge our judgment? Which brings us back to that brethren concept. Speak not evil. And you allow me to paraphrase it a little bit here to give it greater emphasis. Speak not evil against your brethren. I know that because I look at the passage and it says, speak not evil one of another, comma, brethren. Speak not evil against the brethren. You see, our eyes, they deceive us. And our minds many times are deceived by what we think we were able to see, but not by what we know. And thus we need to have the grace that brethren deserve when it comes to the words that we say one to another. There are 4 things that I believe we forget about. I believe we forget about lying because it happens so prevalently in our society. I believe we forget about gossiping because really we don't want to be trapped in it either. I believe we forget about our words. Our yes is yes, our no is no. And the way we speak of our words, the way we speak of the name of God by the way of swearing. OMG is not an innocent phrase because it takes the name of God to an earthly level. And God's name is never an earthly level. It is always much higher. And then criticism, of which we speak of so often, are a part of the 4 forgotten sins that we sometimes ignore. May we recognize that today we can be like those in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 11. And such were some of you. We have a good portion of time today because the sermon is over. And we have an opportunity to sing a song that Bryce has picked out for us and to think about our souls. Maybe you're here this morning and you need to become a Christian. The baptistry is ready for you if you are ready for it. Jesus stands with open arms if you're willing to come to Him. But you'll have to make that decision this morning to become a Christian. Romans 10:17 says this, so then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. The only way you can know how to become a Christian is to get into God's book, which reveals unto us the mind of God. Do you need to become a Christian this morning? You can. You let it be known. But maybe you're a Christian in this room, which I suspect most of you are. Maybe you recognize that there's something in your life that needs to be made right. Maybe it's not one of these 4 things that we listed this morning. Maybe it is. We'll have to determine that in our own souls and respond to our lives to the Lord's invitation and know that prayers will be prayed, that we can be forgiven, and that James 5:16 still stands as strong today as when it was written, and that we can be forgiven. And we can know that the angels in heaven rejoice when God's people come home. Do you need to become a Christian this morning? Do you need to make your life right with the Lord this morning? You let that be known as together we stand and sing.